Welcome. And I'm just very excited to introduce Nicole Terez Dutton. Some of you already know who
Terez.
she is. Um, she was Somerville's first poet laureate and is now the editor of the Kenyon Review and has left our wonderful city for Ohio. And we miss her, but we still have her poems. And was it this year or was it last year that this poem was selected as the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day? And I heard Terez read it at the Somerville Public Library. And Nicole is a wonderful poet, and this poem just completely knocked me out. And we've had very few living writers on this discussion group, but I absolutely couldn't resist inviting Nicole to read this poem today and to join us today. So Nicole, would you honor us with a reading of Magnitude and Bond?
Absolutely, Lloyd, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for having me. And I also just wanted to say, I feel, Lloyd, like something's happened with the pandemic time where it's dilated and strange, and I don't know the chronology of anything anymore, how long ago things were. But I feel like we were together reading in a reading series that Michael organized. And that's where, which seems to me quite a while ago. Michael, does that sound right? I feel like we're in the library there. Yeah.
At the Somerville Library.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the three Somerville poets laureate. Gloria Mindock was the third reader.
That's right. And Jennifer was there. Jennifer, it's good to see you. I'm over here in Ohio holding it down for you. We miss you here. My goodness.
Oh, indeed. Right. Jennifer is now in Somerville and for many years was at the Kenyon Review.
At Kenyon College.
Kenyon College.
We switched places. But yes. Go ahead, Lloyd.
But Jennifer, you did stuff for the Kenyon Review, didn't you?
For a while, early, but then I didn't. I did read manuscripts for a while, but as anybody knows who's done that, it kind of takes up all your time.
Yeah. We got 14,000 submissions last year, so it's a bunch of time. We try to get back to folks in 6 months if we can, but Jennifer's right. It's a lot of time. Okay, so I will read this poem, and thanks again for inviting me and making space for this. Magnitude and Bond. More than anything, I need this boy so close to my ears, his questions electric as honeybees in an acreage of goldenrod and aster, and time where we are, slow sugar in the veins of white pine, rubbery mushrooms cloistered at their feet, his tawny listening at the water's edge, shy antlers in pooling light, while we consider fox prints etched in clay. I need little black boys to be able to be little black boys, whole saltwater galaxies in cotton and loudness, not fixed in stunned suspension, episodes on hot asphalt, waiting in the dazzling absence of apology. I need this kid to stay mighty and coltish, thundering alongside other Black kids, their wrestle and whoop, the brightness of it. I need for the world to bear it. And until it will, may the trees kneel closer while we sit in mineral hush together. May the boy whose dark eyes are an echo of my father's dark eyes and his father's dark eyes reach with cupped hands into the braided current. The boy, restless and lanky, the boy for whom each moment endlessly opens, for the attention he invests in the beetle's lacquered armor, each furrowed seed or heartbeat, the boy who once told me the world gives you second chances. The boy tugging at my arm, saying, look, saying, now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. You can see why I love this poem, I hope. I'm going to ask Nicole in a few minutes to read the statement that she wrote to go along with this poem. But before she does, tell me, what are your first responses to this poem? What do you feel about it when listening to it, or what did you feel about it when you read it for the first time?
That it's so alive. It has so many wonderful images of life going on, of being inclusive, and the even the landscape is sort of bristling with life, and the voice in it is just so encouraging and so and again inclusive, and there's almost a desperation in here, but it's not desperation. It's really love, I think, that carries the poem. And I just love the animal images along with the landscape. And so it's just incredibly rich.
Very rich.
Terez.
Nicole, je m'appelle Terez aussi. So when I read the More Than Anything I Need This Boy So Close to My Ears, his questions, electric as honeybees, that reminded me of my daughter when she's 36 now, and when she was little, and the questions that children ask us are, so honest and so free and so truthful and not edited. And it's so many times it reminded me of my daughter and all the joy. I went through this, I read your statement, and then I read, I went back through, I made lots of notes on the poem about every place where you're talking about joy, and I just, joy in nature, joy with children in nature, joy with your father in nature. And I love at the end where you have your father's voice and your son's voice. I love the way that you did that, and I love hearing you read your poem. You have a beautiful poetry reading voice, which I have experienced is not always the case for poets reading their own poetry. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Terez.
Thank you. And Mary.
Yeah, I would repeat everything that's been said so far. It's such a completely absorbing poem, and I was here via Zoom summer actually when you read it, and it just like Lloyd said, it just knocked me over. It was the poem that kept resonating, one of the poems anyway. But one of the things that I love most about it, in addition to all of the imagery and so on that people have been talking about, is the voice of the boy at the end of the poem. That I don't even have the words to describe it. It's so immediate, and of course now is part of that gesture and what it does. But for me, that's just the kind of craft touch on this poem. He becomes so real, and what he says is so amazing and so poignant, and just stays with you. I just love it. I'm so glad you did that in the poem.
Yeah.
Ellen.
I love this poem, and when we're talking about the way you read this, Nicole, I have this great advantage of having first heard you when we were both part of a spoken word community at the Cantab years ago. So I have heard your beautiful reading. One of the things that strikes me, besides the huge tenderness here, is the "I need," which is like a desperate prayer of protection. And it feels like it's wrapping this child in this prayer and wishing for the world that's so beautifully evoked in natural images to protect this child.
Ellen.
Ruth.
One of the striking things to me is that in the midst of all this gorgeous language and vivid evocation of a child's, response to the natural world, we have the unnatural world. The boy, she wants to be able to be a whole saltwater galaxy in cotton and loudness, not fixed in stunned suspension, episodes on hot asphalt, waiting in the dazzling absence of apology. And that is the crux of this poem, because, it's right in the center of all this beautiful evocation of a child in the world and his relationship to others. We have this horrible thing that's put really remarkably gently in there. You could almost miss it because it's stated in also in beautiful language, but we know we know this is the fear that hangs over this child because he's a little Black boy or children. And that to me is part of the brilliance of this poem, the way it's just kind of slipped in there. And not with a big fanfare, but it's there. It's a terrible thing that's hanging over these children.
Or just this kind of undercurrent running beneath everything else.
Yes.
Yeah. Nicole, would you read the statement that you wrote just in case, and for anyone who hadn't heard it before or seen it before?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This poem, which borrows its title from a line in the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, Paul Robeson, began as a remembrance of my father, who was an enormously joyful person with a keen eye and a mischievous sense of humor, very, very mischievous. As a doctor, my father spent his days helping people through their trauma. He was a psychiatrist, and many evenings relaxing with his dogs in the woods outside our house, listening. Sometimes I sat with him and listened while he pointed out the deer or the sound of the bullfrogs. It was his way to be curious, alert to the world, receptive. Like my father, my son is a watcher, attentive to things large and small, a good listener, present. This poem carries the hope that I learned the things my father taught well, and that in spite of any and everything, should he need it, something of my father's gentleness and strength, something of those slow wooded evenings will be here in these lines for my boy.
I think that statement is a kind of poem in itself. It's so eloquent and so touching, and that it really does put the poem doesn't need it, and yet it puts the poem in a kind of broader context of not only family, but of poetry. I think partly because of the title. And I wonder what some of your responses are to the title of this poem, because I think it's a surprising title, and it's a title that it's an unusual title because in some way it means more after you read the poem than when you see it before you read the poem. But I'm wondering what are some of your thoughts about the title?
I recognized the title because actually I wrote a very minor little golden shovel on that piece of Gwendolyn Brooks' poem. And the poem, her poem to me, is like a connection among people in the world. And so it reaches out from this poem to give all of us the responsibility to keep this child and all other children safe.
Jennifer, yeah.
This is just a small point. The way you put the question, Lloyd, it makes me think of an image I love in this poem. May the boy reach with cupped hands into the braided current. And it's that image of the braided current, which I just love how we can feel like that's a creek running by, or the braided current of his father's eyes and my father's eyes, or the larger braided current that the poem gestures towards, the current of time, the current of connection. So I love the way the poem makes me feel when I'm looking back to see how it does it. It's through gestures like that, where I could see the whole thing through the boy's eyes in terms of the natural details, but I'm feeling what the mother is thinking too about what those imply past the intimacy into the larger world. So I guess magnitude and bond for me, the bond is there and magnitude is the larger world.
Yeah. Right. I find that any other thoughts about the words in the title? Pick. Jennifer sort of got to that part of my question at the end of her statement.
There's an opposition, isn't there, between the abstractness of the terms in the title and the concreteness of the poem, and eventually the concrete details which the poem compiles press up behind the abstractions and confer meaningfulness on them. I didn't take the magnitude in quite the way that Jennifer did. To me, it sort of linked up with the littleness of the boy when he first appears and the mightiness which he later manifests. The bond is clear enough, of course, it's the bond between the mother and the child. But abstract language is something we're taught to go in fear of, aren't we? Ezra Pound says, go in fear of abstractions, and yet this poem redeems the abstractions by linking them so intricately to the concretions in the poem, I think.
There's something Uh, I Jane, is that? Oh, no, I thought you had your hand up, but you're just adjusting your computer. Um, uh, I don't know. Uh, for me, the title is, and this is something that Jennifer was sort of was getting at also. The title is very large, and this is what I think what Bill's talking about, the abstractions of the title. They're really they're just enormous issues. I mean, just the word magnitude has a kind of enormously large scale to it, which and even bond as a kind of abstraction, as a kind of condition, where, I mean, bond is a kind of, there's something ambiguous about it too, isn't there? That it's bond is something, bonds of affection, which of course turns out to be a very integral part of the poem, but bond is also a chain, imprisonment, and that the in some way I take the title of the poem as a kind of challenge. That is, this title is making a very large claim for this poem, and coming from the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, I think kind of adds to that. If you know the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, and then Paul Robeson is such a gigantic figure, and that the poem, that the title is in some way sort of challenging us to read the poem and see in what way the poem kind of lives up to the very large statement of the title, and it does, but in a kind of, in a very surprising and rather an indirect way, or an indirect isn't quite right, but in a kind of surprising way, uh, it, it, uh, because the poem is so intimate, or among its other qualities is a kind of intimacy which seems in some way the opposite of the big words in the title, and that, what I mean, one of the things that's so marvelous about this poem is the way in this kind of sneaky way, the poem lives up to the large scale of the title. Um, um, and oh, Brian, yeah.
Thanks. I'm not an expert on Gwendolyn Brooks. I hadn't heard the phrase before, but for all the, not nearsightedness, but for all the eye for detail and the little ways in which a child might be provided for and enriched by the world, it felt like the scope and scale of the, I forget who mentioned it as a prayer for protection, but the scope and scale of that felt so grand compared to what many other parents might wish for their children, that they follow a very narrow track to living a good life, but without. So I really enjoyed, and I'm grateful for the ability to hold such small examples and the massive impact of those together as a child of parents. I feel like the times when someone saw those experiences for me and saw how impactful they were tremendously helpful to me. So I really appreciated that.
Susan. Yeah, you're
Come on, I'm okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just the words that really took me immediately is the difference between I need and I want. And I need, to me, is where the magnitude is. And that and also speaking as a parent, you know, I'm not sure I would use the word I need as much as I would use the word I want. So I wonder, Nicole, would you speak about that? The choice of those? It's very profound to me.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is a prayer for protection, and I think it's also, this is a poem that was written in you know, in a there's just an ongoing kind of spree of extrajudicial killings of Black people, Black men, and then this is Mike Brown, this is Tamir Rice. We get into that we were actually Black children being killed by other people or police. And so I do think that there is this need to recognize, like, first of all, these are children, in fact, and Black boys aren't necessarily afforded childhood, you know, and you know, the ability to play and be loud without that being perceived as dangerous. And so I do think, for me, it does feel really necessary to stop and to acknowledge the fact that, first of all, they're children, but second of all, we're humans, and everyone deserves a moment of pause, you know, before someone is going to perceive them as a threat that is best dealt with by pulling the trigger. You know, certainly there must be other ways, and there must be other training, and there must be other opportunity to pause. So yeah, that feels very, very necessary. And I also want to say that, you know, for this poem in particular, you know, my father is from Baltimore, like definitely a city kid, you know, and it was very hard when he came to Cleveland with my mom to go to medical school and ended up staying. And we lived in the city, the suburbs, but ended up, you know, there was a whole kind of plague of redlining that was happening. And so my family, alongside 4 other Black professional families, moved out to and integrated these other communities. So my parents lived in Chagrin Falls. My mom still lives there, which is a place that Black people couldn't live. Black people could live in Chagrin Falls Park, which was traditionally
Oh, you just froze.
outpost that was right next to Chagrin Falls proper. So this when we arrived in Chagrin Falls, it was very much kind of, it was a hard-won place for us to be. And so my dad never, ever, ever forgot that. And none of us ever forgot that. And when we first arrived, that was not a safe place. This was a place where we were pursued. You know, we were followed by the police. This was did not have the feeling of safety. But eventually, over time, it became our home. And there was always just such great, it was such a privilege to be there. And also just it was just like an oasis that my parents had cultivated to keep us safe, and a place where we could thrive. And so I just wanted to say that this kind of connection with the outdoors and the sanctuary of the forest and kind of our house ensconced in it was not only hard won, but something that was very much a haven for my family. And we never forgot how hard it was to attain that, and the feeling of peace that my parents managed to kind of cultivate within that household.
Not something you could take for granted, in other words.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Right.
Jen,
Yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing about reading between the 2 poems, the Paul Robeson poem and this one, which is the words magnitude and bond in the Brooks poem come from the phrase, we are each other's magnitude and bond. And that we is addressed to the human we. What Nicole is talking about, we humans need to afford each other the right to be seen as human. And this is something we all owe each other. And I think using that phrase, magnitude and bond, for the title also helps us go from kind of the parenthesis that's parent and child, we are each other's magnitude and bond, to the larger we that's implied in the lines that Ruth mentioned from the middle of the poem. The episodes on hot asphalt, waiting for the dazzling absence of apology. Who's out there? And it shouldn't just be mother and child. It should be the broader bond. And I like the way the poem says, read not just how do these words fit into the poem, but read between the two poems and how are they talking to each other. How does Nicole's poem give us a present instance of something the Brooks poem suggests, and what happens when we read back and forth between the two?
I think I also read it, the magnitude of the hopefulness which the poem expresses as bearing a certain ambiguity. When we get to the line, I need for the world to bear it, I'm not quite sure which meaning we're meant to ascribe to bear. Bear could mean merely tolerate, but it could mean sustain and support. So the magnitude of the hopefulness then can be constructed in two different ways. Is it hopeful for a world which tolerates little black boys, or for one which is actually nurturing and nourishing? It could be aspiring to a rather better condition. And I'm also a little bit uncertain about the will in the line afterwards, until it will. I don't know whether my English ear perceives will differently from an American one. When I grew up, I was taught that when we conjugate the future tense, we use shall with the first person, I shall go, we shall go, and then we use will with the second and third persons, so that if we use shall and will in those senses, we're merely expressing futurity. But if we flip them around and say I will, we're then expressing resolution or commitment. I will do something is not merely saying that it will happen in the future, one's resolving to do it. But we were also told that, and this is where I suppose the room comes into play, that the opposite state of affairs obtains in America. And indeed we were given, I remember being given a little anecdote, you know, if someone is drowning in a river and shouts out, I will drown, and an Englishman walking by leaves the person there, because I will drown implies they want to drown, whereas an American going by perceives that as merely describing a future state and dives in to drag them out. I don't know if that makes any sense to the Americans here, but that's what I was told. And it's going back to the poem, finally, and until it will, I'm not sure whether will is expressing the certainty that this state of affairs will come about, it's a future condition which will eventually be instantiated, or whether it's rather expressing resolution. Anyway.
I would say we're American English put shall in a we don't use it.
Oh, really?
Uh,
Okay.
unless we absolutely have to, or we are technically, drawing grammatical distinctions, but shall is we really don't use it a lot. Susan?
Okay.
No, I'm thinking about maybe the most surprising word in Elizabeth Bishop's One Art is "I shan't have lied."
Ah.
And that shan't is just a word that never gets used by Americans, let alone in American poetry. So it's a kind of, it's really quite startling to have that word, but
So does that mean that American English can't, as it were, express that nuance? So in English, in theory, you can say "I shall" meaning future, and "I will" meaning resolution, but that difference isn't really available to American English.
I think that's mainly true. I
Okay.
think that's mainly true. Yeah.
But going back to bear, can I ask Nicole what
Yeah.
whether you were aware of those two meanings and whether that was an intended doubleness?
I think that's interesting, and thank you for asking this question. And I will tell you that I struggled with the grammar of these lines for a really long time, not because I was thinking about shall, but kind of how to link all of these ideas together. The want for the child to grow up and be afforded not only just basic humanity, but to be rowdy and loud and present, and like little kids can be, and have that be okay. And then also for that to be just acceptable, but also embraced as kind of just a luxury of childhood, and just something that we understand, that children, it's not always convenient for them to be loud and whooping and galaxies of noise. So I was thinking of it in that sense, like bear, like yes, it can support the weight of even perceived sort of misbehavior, or just like inconvenient behavior, and I guess I wasn't really thinking of it in terms of tolerance. That's the low bar, but I think more just that we carve a space for children and keep them safe within that, and have an agreed upon understanding that they can be rowdy and wild, and that's part of childhood. So I think I was thinking more in that sense, if that answers your question.
A lot
It does.
in that. Mary? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to pick up on more on the bear. I mean, if you think of it as bearing, like to bear a child, there's also that of, a little strand of invocation for the world itself to become a maternal presence, to take on a maternal role in some way. And I really like the way bear can bounce between mere toleration and taking on a maternal aspect. I don't know. It's just a playful thing that I thought the word can do, but it's at the same time, it's very heavy. And can I say something really quick about the title?
Please. Yeah.
Because I know we started with the title and then we wandered off, but I just wanted to say I'm always really interested in what I think of as maternal poetics, or maternal perspective in poetry. And so one of the things that struck me about the poem, well, the only poem that it called to mind was Brooks's "In the Mecca," and the way that it encompasses a maternal desperation, grief, and prayer. So I just love that the title, which eluded me, I had forgotten about the poem Magnitude and Bond, but I love that Brooks is kind of in there. It's just a really nice element, I think. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you. No, thanks. I want to go back to I want to go back to the title as well, but I want to go back to the title in relation to the first line. And I know that when I heard the title for the first time, and I heard the poem before I read it, and when I heard the title for the first time, I was sort of about to bracing myself for sort of, these large scale issues. And then the transition from the title to the first line, more than anything, is extremely personal and intimate and kind of, I am telling you this important thing about myself. More than anything, I need this boy so close to my ears. That the contrast or the tension or the transition from between the largeness of the title and the intimacy of the poet in what seems to be her real personal present voice just struck me enormously. I would say even hooked me into, oh, I was not expecting, more than anything, I need this boy so close to my ears. I was not expecting that idea or that language in a poem titled Magnitude and Bond. So that I kind of, then I got so involved with the poem that I sort of stopped thinking about the title until much later in the poem, or maybe not even until the end of the poem. And the way what was happening in the poem really justified the large scale of that title, of the language in the title. So that was, I don't know, that was my reaction to that. And then just the intimacy of, I need this boy so close to my ears. And then we get into a slightly different kind of language of imagery. And I'm surprised again. His questions, electric as honeybees in an acreage of goldenrod and aster, which is suddenly I'm in the world of, not only in the world of nature, but in the world of nature as it's described in poetry. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit.
I'm sorry?
I
Oh,
understand
Terez.
that. I understand that, a little bit as a, not as a, as a secondary, thought about it.
I'm just thinking about the way the poem works, the way the poem in its language works in so many different and interesting ways. That there is that there's a kind of variety of language that Nicole is leading us through. That it isn't just colloquial, it isn't abstract. It's doing lots of things that I find very compelling and surprising as I read it. And it's one of the things that Jim, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment on acreage, because acreage enlarges the perspective, the natural perspective, in the same way that magnitude and bond enlarges the the broader informational or poetic intention, and so it goes from the idealizations of the title to the extraordinarily intimate of the boy. I need this boy so close, but then acreage again expands it, and so we're plunged also into the incredible natural world as well. So I think that's part of the brilliance of the poem. It's really quite stunning.
Then, but also electric,
Right.
which
Right.
is really, I want to say shocking, but his question's electric, and that suddenly, that's also it's a new language for the poem that just ignites our attention. I found that word, for want of a better word, electrifying. I really
Electric ignites, as you say,
yeah.
And again, it has that mixed thing of both danger and excitement all in one.
Yeah, and then electric as honeybees,
Right.
and that, oh, well, I don't think I ever thought about bees as electric, but boy, that works. And the hum and the buzz and the danger, and then in an acreage of goldenrod and aster, and then it's suddenly so beautiful. And there is nature and all these flowers, and the flowers are the bees are feeding off the flowers, and we want bees, and bees are a good thing, and flowers are a good thing, and it's so beautiful. And then it's so specific, goldenrod and aster, and I can absolutely picture that. I picture that scene, and I also hear it. And I hear it without being told that the bees are buzzing or humming or the way they are in most poetry about nature. And that it's just so alive and constantly prodding my interest, compelling my interest, just aside from the subject, which turns out to be a real subject and powerful and moving, but as language, the poem is so interesting. I mean, interesting is an understatement, but just really so compelling that it makes me want to go forward, and it makes me want to linger over every detail at the same time, so that there's that there is a kind of tension, or summons my attention at every moment. Nicole, you talked about struggling with with the grammar of part of it, and I'm just sort of curious how easily or how not easily this poem came to you, because it's doing so many things. I I would imagine it was a lot of work. Just as another writer, I would imagine that it was a lot of work. But what was it like to what was writing this poem like?
I think there was a moment where there was this kind of scattershot of ideas that I wanted to corral into a poem. And so I think for me, it's not uncommon to not know exactly where I'm headed. And so I feel like there was a lot of iterations where what the heart of this was, and my notion of kind of how this may kind of be in conversation with Gwendolyn Brooks and Paul Robeson and my father, all of whom it seems to me are just, did good, worthy work that is fundamentally hopeful, and in the veins of resistance, I would say. And just I wanted very much to think about that, and to think about the debt of gratitude, owed them. And then also to think about, this is written right after my father passed away, and just to think about how to communicate that to my son, who I hope can also be a part of that tradition. So I think it took a long time, just like it took a long time for me to say that sentence. It took a long time for me to think about how to get all of that into a poem, or if it belonged in one poem, And so yeah, I think there was a lot of drafting. And even as I look at it now, Lloyd, I can always edit a thing. So even as I look at it now, I feel like, oh my goodness, I'm not sure. I could make some edits right now and just compress this a little bit, and definitely change some of these commas and line breaks, but that's endless for me. That's not uncommon. And I saw that Brian had his hand up, but I didn't.
Oh, thank you. So Brian and then John.
Thank you for noticing. This goes back a bit to earlier when we were talking about the not sudden, but the shift from the title to the first couple of lines. And I was noticing that as we talk about, I need this voice so close to my ears, if someone just said that, I would immediately go to fear. That what if something happens that I'm not able to hear it in time? What if car comes? What if there's the shattering of glass? And so when I first read it, I went there, and then immediately had to hop away from that, because the lines that followed are nothing fearful, and even welcoming and summoning sounds that people might not notice normally. I mean, I grew up with a lot of bees around, and so for me, the buzzing of bees, once I stopped being stung by them, became a very joyful and present part of my mornings. And then I noticed sounds all throughout the poem, his tawny listening at the water's edge, cotton and loudness, the thunder, and then a silence in the middle, the dazzling absence of apology. I wanted to ask, as you came in with this set of ideas you wanted to include, were you already thinking, I want to frame these as sounds, the way my father would point out sounds in the forest? Or did that kind of just materialize?
Brian, I'm so sorry. My internet is unstable and froze just in the middle part of your question. And so I heard the dazzling absence of silence, and then can you rephrase? Can you say that
Sure,
again?
yeah.
Sorry.
So I noticed all these sounds, and my dad would point out the different bird calls to me. I wanted to ask, as you were writing the poem, it sounded like you had a set of ideas you wanted to bring in and express. And you mentioned your father pointing out sounds in the forest to you. Were you already thinking of framing this in terms of sound, instead of pointing more at some other sense?
No, that's a great question. And I didn't have any, and I'm in love with music, and my parents are in love with music, and my boy's in love with music. And my grandfather also was a birder and could imitate all of the bird sounds. So I feel like, I don't know, there's something very kind of about the experience of being at my parents' house that is just like being awash in all of this music and all of this. It's a little, it's just lush. There's a lushness there that's wonderful and amazing and loud. So I don't know, I feel like I'm just preoccupied with music, and that's kind of why the poem may be suffused with it. But I also am a person who learns best visually, and so that's my first, always my point of access. My first point of entry into a moment is probably the visual image as opposed to the oral one. So I feel like both of them are equally, they compete for priority in all poems. But no, I don't think, I think what is noticeable really here about the silence, and that's really a specific reference to Mike Brown, who they did murder, and they did leave him, this child, on the ground for 12, 14 hours, while they, got their stories and facts together, and very visibly. And so that's kind of, to me, just like shocking. And that is there's a real silence around treating any human that way and allowing it to be visible in that way that is not supported in the world of this kind of safekeeping and love and vigilance, of family and care that happens really within the poem.
John, what were you going to say?
When Nicole was talking about wanting to edit the poem even years later, I mean, I can understand that. But I wonder if when she was reading the poem, especially the last stanza, did anyone notice that the poem that's printed reads, "The boy tugging my arm, saying, look, saying now," whereas when Nicole read it, she read it, "The boy tugging at my arm." And for the past hour, I've been sitting here sort of juggling this thing. Which is better, one or the other? And I finally realized that I preferred not to have "at" in the line. I don't know if Nicole, if that was intentional or you just spontaneously read that, but I prefer tugging my arm because there's much more urgency in that image than tugging at my arm, which almost trivializes it, as if he wants to get an orange soda and he's sort of tugging at the sleeve, whereas tugging my arm, there's almost as if he's grabbing it and he wants something bigger than an orange soda. So I just wanted to ask Nicole, how intentional was that, and even ask the other people here, which do you prefer? And Emily, the cat, what do you prefer?
It was unintentional, John. I'm not quite sure. I wasn't aware that I added that, but I totally agree. And I feel like it's an extra syllable that doesn't need to be, doesn't add anything, particularly kind of with that trio of gerunds there, where I just really kind of, I think the other heart of the poem is really paying attention. And I feel like my boy is always reminding me that that's something essential in coding anyway. It's just like the quality of attention that you invest in all of these things. So I wanted the line to be slowed down by this kind of the action, but then also just like his calling me into a kind of attention. That's what I was hoping the gerund would do. And so the "at," that was, I don't know what happened. I apologize. That wasn't supposed to be there. I just threw that in.
Yeah. Well, the situation is, whenever you're writing a poem or rewriting it, you're always walking on lava. And you always want to sort of get past it, but you want to stay there and really experience it and try to figure out what is the best thing to do here. And so there's these contrary things pulling you in two different directions. But anyway, that's something every writer has to deal with.
Pulling at you.
Yes.
The beautiful slow sugar in the veins of white pine. I mean, that's just such gorgeous writing. And I think I wouldn't like this poem if it were all like that, because I tend to be very suspicious of writing that gets to be too poetic. And yet here, in this context, it seems as beautiful as you want this description to be. And it's partly because the poem starts with more than anything. And I think of, you know, one of the most beautiful poems in the English language is Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which has all of this, you know, fabulous, wonderful description of nature. But the poem begins, "My heart aches." So you're coming from something very personal and very intimate and going out into the world, and that world includes poetry and the language of poetry, but it doesn't just stay there. And I love that happens in this poem, that there is that the descriptions of nature have this, you know, are kind of equated with the beauty of nature is equated with the beauty of language. But that's not the only kind of language that's in the poem. And that seems to me just wonderful. And that to get from there, I mean, his tawny listening at the water's edge, shy antlers in pooling green light, fox prints etched in clay. We're really in a world of kind of very, kind of gorgeous writing about nature, and very fresh, very original, but also in that world of in that the world of that kind of writing. And then we get the heart of the, you know, the heart of the poem suddenly hits us with, I need. We're going back to the intimacy of the opening line. I need little black boys to be able to be little black boys. And it's just, I want to say heartbreaking, but heart stopping. That this intimacy that Nicole, the poet, wants us to know this. And she wants us to know this in a language that isn't, that's the language of intimacy, not the language of poetry. And that the transformation, the movement in the poem, the movement of the language of the poem, so gets to me, and I love the description of nature, because you can do that in an enviable, fresh and original way. But I as I read that, is the rest of the poem going to be like that? And then it isn't. And it becomes, again, the language of directness and intimacy that's really just heart-stopping. And I think that's just, it's just extraordinary to come to that, and it's so moving. Susan, you need to put your sound on.
Yeah, but what about these lines where we go back to the trees kneeling closer and mineral hush? That's goes back to this gorgeous poetry, does it not?
Sure, it does.
Yeah. So
it does.
It's all in the cultish, it's just, yeah.
But I think, that's really the point that I want to make, is that there's, the whole poem has this, I want to say, kind of confidence about language and about using different kinds of language and structuring itself in feeling comfortable about moving between different kinds of language in a poem, and that to be able to do that is it just seems just wonderful to me. And it you know, I want to say Susan Larson and I were talking about some concerts that we had heard one and actually been to another, and we're kind of agreeing about the way one of those concerts had this compelling and sort of electrifying variety and confidence about detail and being able to change from one kind of emotional response to another, and having this flexibility that really kept you on the edge of your chair. I mean, it was riveting, and that I see that quality in this poem, that it's not just one thing going on with language from the beginning of the poem to the end of the poem, that this is a poem that can actually move beautifully and confidently between different kinds of language, and all feel genuine. I mean, that the risk of the poetic language, which is just seems to me true of a risk that every poet faces, is that it can just sound phony. It can sound, literary or academic, or, just, and I hate poetry. Sorry. That's simply kind of, thinking of Marianne Moore about poetry. I too dislike it. That if it's just poetic, it's really not interesting. But to be able to move between and among different ways of writing seems to be one of the extraordinary things about this poem.
Can we hear what Jane has to say?
Okay? Yes, of course.
Thank you. I'm taken by the end. Told me the world gives you second chances. And the boy tugging my arm, saying, look, saying now. And one of the things, I love this poem. I think it's just beautiful, but it's beautiful is small in comparison to what it is, because there's just so much, it's huge. And it's like this whole, it's like the whole world, this poem, in a way. It's huge. And that line feels to me to be kind of less poetic in a way. And it kind of brings you to the now in a way. It brings you to where we are now, and what we're struggling with. And also brings you out into hope. And it's just like the whole thing is huge. It's got the whole world is here, it seems. I hate to laugh, but it's gorgeous. I don't have the language for it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Good enough. Yeah. and yeah, I mean, ending there. I mean, you just love this child who is being so interested and attentive.
Your sound is gone from me. I don't know.
My sound.
Yeah, it was gone. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it goes in and out sometimes,
This
sometimes.
whole thing has been like that. I don't know what's been wrong, but
hard to tell when you're
Yeah.
speaking that you're not being heard.
yes.
So
Yeah.
so please let me know
Yeah.
and let us know.
Can I just say
Uh,
something a little more about, it's
course.
like the world gives you second chances and you're kind of thinking, well, does it? Well, that's what I'm thinking. Well, does it? But, and then the boy tugging my arm, it's like pulling you back, tugging my arm, saying, look, saying now. And man, that's the whole world. that's you're wanting, you're hoping, you're striving, you're, you know, I just love it. I don't have the words for it. I'm sorry.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
you do.
Before I forget this, I would like to say that, you know, it just, I've been, you know, making some notes. So one of them is every child deserves to experience this joy of life, the natural world and every other world. But it occurs to me that, you know, bringing that together with the Gwendolyn Brooks is, that's the part about, you know, the bond of everyone. So what this poem, you know, did for me was also remind me that every Black child gets to enjoy, should get to enjoy, hopefully gets to enjoy the natural world. I mean, it seemed to me that I just only recently noticed that Audubon was showing Black people in their pictured advertising as, you know, being, you know, part of nature. I don't, you know, particularly remember, you know, seeing a lot of, you know, Sierra Club and all kinds of other things, you know, having encouraging or showing, you know, people of color, Black people in nature. I know there are a lot of children's books now that have, you know, Black children in nature. So, you know, as a, you know, as someone who was raised by a racist white father, you know, I try to, you know, be more attentive to, you know, what's going on, you know, how we're, you know, we're all together. So it's a, you know, it's a struggle. So I really appreciate having that, you know, the reminder through this poem of how you use the language to, you know, nature, and then you came back into race, and then you went back to, you know, poetic nature. I just really appreciated it, and it really it caused me to become very aware of, you know, all to go through the whole poem and learn a lot for myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Terez. Can I also just say that this is a weird American narrative somehow, that we don't imagine Blackness, you know, participating in anything other than an urban kind of situation. Which, I mean, you think about the country, that's preposterous. You think about the history of the country, obviously, that can't be the case. But there are these kind of prevailing narratives that just really kind of, I would say, constitute an erasure or just something very myopic around Blackness and Black participation, Black life. And that's on all kinds of levels, you know, including, I would even just say, I don't know if you all saw the that Netflix special on food, High on the Hog. Did you
Yeah,
watch
yeah.
this? And talked about kind of how, like, shellfish, that was, you know, that was Staten Island, right? And that was all Black folks out there collecting shellfish and selling them, and that was a delicacy. But there's this perception like, oh, like black people don't have oysters as a part of the culinary tradition. And of course, like this notion of what soul food is a very sort of a very limited kind of thing that doesn't reflect history. But these stories, they're worth repeating. They're worth codifying. They're worth putting into poems. This experience, it's worth kind of understanding that the experience, the American experience, is large in general, and that's true also of Black people, and it's diverse, and there's all kinds of ways of being American and in this country, and it's not just a thing for anybody. So I think it's important to recognize that. And for me, again, like the notion of the natural world is really something that is a sanctuary that was afforded to me by my parents. And all parents do this. You all do this, right? You create the sanctuary, the space that your babies can thrive in. And so like part of this is just really kind of looking at this space that my father fought very hard for and just kind of, cultivated by force of will, for us to be safe and thrive in. And my little guy got a chance to see that and participate in that a little bit. He was little, but just kind of, I always want that space and the love that builds that space to stay present for my son.
Your son, as I recall, was at that poetry reading.
He sure was. He sure was. Writing poems, by the way.
Writing poems.
Writing poems.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great.
How old is he now?
He's 8.
He's 8 now.
Yeah. I'll tell you, he's 8 and 11, 12. He's
Somebody else.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of poets bringing their children to poetry readings.
Yeah.
Lloyd, Mariana has her hand up.
Sorry. Please.
Oh, no,
Mariana?
no apologies necessary. Do you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Mariana. Yeah. It's so good to see you.
Hi,
I didn't recognize you.
I know, I apologize. I'm on a train, but I wanted to listen in. I love the poem. It made me cry when I read it, when Lloyd sent it out. And it was so good to hear you read it. And what I wanted to say, it feels to me like a call to arms poem. I'm sorry that it sounds so, I don't know, it feels very belligerent, but I love that you said that it has resistance in it, because to me, it feels like every single beautiful line of poetic language, as Lloyd referred to it, carries with it the ghost of the oppression. And the contrast of that works really well for me. At least it's heartbreaking. And at the same time, there's the love and the resistance of it in every line, which basically helps hold this unbearable weight. I as much as I see it as something really uplifting, I also see it as there is so much for us to keep doing as humanity. And I also see it in the context of this beautiful nature that's also disappearing on us, which is all connected. And I love magnitude and bond encompasses all of this. Anyway, thank you. And it's so good to see your face.
Thank you, Mariana. It's so good to see you too.
I love it. Thank you.
Where are you traveling to or from?
I'm traveling from Boston to Belfast, Maine for the weekend.
Great. It's sort of nice to have that train behind you in your image.
Here, I
yes.
can show you the window.
I was thinking about this line right in the middle of the poem, I need this kid to stay mighty. And I have complicated feelings about people who are talking about their quote kids. And in this line, in this poem, it seems to me to really work. And that somehow in this context, I see or hear the word kid in its literal meaning, in its sort of in its animal meaning, as well as in its colloquial meaning as a child, and that kind of double sense, which I never hear when parents talk about their kids. I mean, that's sort of what they do all the time. And yet here, I mean, partly because in the first line, we've already heard about this boy that, and then we hear about the shy antlers and the fox prints, and I need little black boys to be able to be little black boys, and that boys and oh, can someone put themselves on mute, because we're hearing a conversation? Oh, okay. Good, it worked. Anyway, it seems to me that the double meaning of kid really comes out in the center of this poem, really means something. And so the kind of very colloquial use of the word kid is kind of inseparable from the literal meaning of the word kid. And I find that incredibly touching. And I don't have that, I'm disarmed by my resistance to just the colloquial way that parents talk about their children. So it's one of the things that I need this kid to stay mighty, and that mighty and cultish, and it, well, I'm very impressed by that. And I'm really, I'm just thinking about writing and the way this poem is written, and how much I really want, not just what the poem is about and what it means and what it's saying, but how wonderfully it's doing that. And that it seems to me it's what I want poetry to be, and what makes me love poetry. So I need this kid to stay mighty and cultish. And I think that stanza break is a wonderful break. If you don't, I wouldn't, I don't think you should change any of the line breaks that I can think of, but I think that line break and that stanza break is kind of thrilling. I need this kid to stay mighty and cultish, thundering alongside other black kids. Their wrestle and whoop. you know, using wrestle as not saying wrestling, but wrestle somehow has a lot more resonance because, well, maybe they're wrestling with each other, but they're also wrestling with the world and wrestling with issues and using wrestle, which, you know, can be a verb as well as a noun. It's just every moment in this poem pulls me into the poem, and I think it's thrilling. Their wrestle and whoop, the brightness of it, I need for the world to bear it. And yeah, we've talked about that already.
Lloyd,
Can I say something quickly?
Oh yeah, please.
How often are you all meeting?
I'm sorry?
How often do you all meet and talk about work?
Once a month.
Yeah. I just
Lloyd,
Yes.
Susan Larson has been
Yeah,
trying
please.
for a long time.
I'm sorry. Please.
Well, I counted. I think there are 5 needs in there. There's one that's invisible. I don't know whether Nicole would agree with that, but you know, and I need this boy close to my ears, and then I need time, but it's not in there, but it's time where we are, maybe. And this goes on for down to the what I thought was the turn of the poem, place that made me cry. I need for the world to bear it, and until it will, then there are no more needs. There's may. You know, may this kid drink from this brook. May this kid, you know.
And that becomes that becomes a kind of prayer, doesn't it?
Well, also a directive. I don't know. It's stronger than I need. It's subjunctive. You know, it's, you know, maybe may this kid be in the sanctuary, drink from the brook, look at the beetle. But I just adore this.
Thank you so much, Susan. I do think that there's something in there that is prayerful and wishful, and also that, you know, and it's every parent's wish to command that everyone be on their best behavior for the safety of their kid. So I think there is something that is a real kind of hope that people can abide and can and understand this parental perspective and this need.
And then we finally see the boy, restless and lanky.
Yeah.
The boy for whom each moment endlessly opens.
Endlessly opens. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, how risky it would be for a poem on this subject to fall into a multitude of cliches about race, about children, about nature, you know, about all of the subjects that come up in the poem, and it never does. It seems to me always alive, always genuine, and I know I've heard from some of you when I first sent out the poem saying, "Oh, I just love this poem." And so we are running out of time, and you know, we could talk about every word in this poem, and how much pleasure and feeling and illumination it gives us. But Meg at the library is has her work cut out for her. And I don't know if you have any last comments, but Nicole, yeah.
Yeah, I just really quickly, I wanted to thank you for inviting me, and I can't believe y'all do this once a month, and I want to come back and listen to you talk about other people's poems. And I also want to just say, like, it's such a gift to have your words considered so carefully and responded to. That doesn't happen. So thank you for that, for all your thoughts and for conferring all of your, smart observations on my poem. That's also sort of, revelatory and wonderful for me to hear that you all find so much in this poem, sometimes even beyond what I intended. So I love that, and I thank you. And then also really briefly, Ted Clausen said that he wanted to understand a little bit about this quote from the boy to Harka. And this is, you know how kids are. They just say amazing, true, wild things. And they are feral in that way, where they have that policy of radical honesty. So if they think it, they say it. And this is something that he said, and I was really struck by his confidence. And we talk about confidence, Lloyd. Like, the kids, they show up, but they're exactly who they are, and they know what they know, and they tell you all about it. So he said this with just like absolute, he was sure that this was the case. And he said this to me to comfort me, just like, yeah, the world gives you second chances, Mom. Like, this is a fact. That I found that so hopeful and so wonderful that he had that. And I want, you want your kids, they do show up who they are, and you want them in some way to stay, to stay that close to the collective, and with all of that energy and awareness, that sometimes gets foreclosed by age and habit. So yeah,
well,
hopeful
well,
that keep that.
Well, now you're sounding like Wordsworth.
Yeah.
And the way the honesty and perception and intelligence of children kind of get the risk is that they're going to turn into, businessmen or academics and just lose all that that aliveness. And I hadn't actually thought about this poem before in relation to, Tintern Abbey and the Great Ode, but they do share those issues. And one of the triumphs of this poem is that you absolutely believe that he said that. That a really amazing thing at the end of the poem about the world gives you second chances. As I said, we've had very few living poets. We mainly talk about, Keats and Wordsworth and Robert Hayden and I'm so glad you were able to do this, and thank you so much. And I will put you on my mailing list, on our mailing list, and please,
thank you.
Whenever you're free to come. And thank you, everyone, as always, for oh, Mariana, you're out of your train.
Arrived.
Blue sky, wonderful.
Yeah,
And thank you all for coming. And Meg, again, thank you so much for taking care of us.
My pleasure. You guys are the best. See you next time.
This was wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you all. So good to see you.
Yeah, really fabulous poem.
Yes.
Thank you.